Hello, welcome.
Hello.
So today on the show, we're going to talk about Jill Dando and her murder and the subsequent investigation that went along with that. And as the title suggests, this is actually an unsolved crime. At one point, they thought they solved it, and then they didn't. And so we'll go through all the hems and haws of that today. I did want to say that this started as an idea that I had to do one show about celebrities who were stalked and killed. Mm-hmm. And then I went down several rabbit holes, and I had picked out 7 different celebrities that had been stalked and either killed or harmed. And there are so many more than 7, of course, and not all of them did I necessarily want to investigate or talk about, but this is not one episode. We could have, right? We could have talked in a very surface way.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been like drinking water from a fire hose. But
I mean, would have been like, okay, well, we'll talk about that some other time.
I don't want so much there.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem to be in my nature necessarily to want to just do some sort of like overview of it. Although we do those kinds of things for sure. But this was just a bigger idea, and I got interested in it and reading about it. And I was riffing off of Kathy did a 2-part episode educating us, talking about stalking as a crime and the forensic implications and how it's seen in the court and behaviors and victimology and all the different things. And I was interested in that, and I think you guys were too. And so I was coming up with ideas of where we could go with that and what I could contribute. And this is how we started. And so I have one case for you today because it just went awry. There was just so much, and it is really interesting. And I thought this one in particular, so then Kathy and I were talking and narrowing it down, and I thought this one in particular would be good because it's an unsolved case, and we've been doing a lot of unsolved case files this season. So in season 7, which will start here in September of 2024, I'll continue this as far as the interest takes me, and of course, if it's interesting to you guys. So with that said, on the morning of April 26, 1999, 37-year-old Jill Dando left her fiance's home and did a couple of errands and went to her own house at about 11:30 in the morning. And just as she got to the door, she was grabbed by the arm and shot execution style in front of her home with no witnesses. It was a full 15 minutes before one of her neighbors called the police and said that there was a body in front of her door. And I've heard the 911 call, or actually it's in England, so they probably call it something else. But our 911 call, and they had the neighbor, go up to her and sort of check for signs of life. And you can hear the woman get pretty upset because it was quite obvious that she was deceased, and her arms were blue and there was a lot of blood and all of that, and no one had really witnessed it. Now, there were some things that they did witness, but we'll get into that as we go along. I also saw the clip of the newscaster that was actually her friend or her coworker when they originally announced her killing and her death, say that she was stabbed, and she wasn't stabbed, she was shot. So that was how early in that they wanted to report on it, but they just didn't have a lot of information in the beginning. So Jill Dando was an English journalist, a television presenter, and a very, very, very popular media personality in England. They called her second to Princess Diana as far as popularity. And there was one thing I watched, and I saw someone called her, the person called Diana England's Rose, and Jill England's Sunflower.
She kind of has that like blonde hair, blue eye Diana look to her too.
Yeah, she had the same haircut. It was during the same period of time, and she was just incredibly popular. Not only did she spend most of her career at the BBC, and she was Personality of the Year in 1997, but at the time of her death, she'd been working on a television show called Crime Watch with Nick. Immediately, everyone thought, oh, it must be somebody from somebody she's reported on in Crime Watch, because she was literally, her living was doing exactly what we're doing right now, which is talking about this case and unsolved things, and then having people come on. It was the same equivalent. We had a show like that back then. I think that Kathy enjoyed, and it was very popular for her, like Unsolved Mysteries or something.
A bunch of those, yeah.
From what I gathered, and I think Kathy has something to add to this, but she grew up in a very well-adjusted family. She had one sibling, a brother, who she was very close to. She was raised Baptist. She was a devout follower, from what I could tell. Had a good relationship with her parents and got a good education. Went to journalism school, and we were off to the races. I mean, I don't know what that's like, but she was one of those people that sort of went to school, had a career, and then stayed in that career.
She had also been pestered by a stalker for 4 years. That they found that theoretically at the beginning, he was obviously a suspect in her homicide. But I guess they ruled that out since they haven't found anybody. But she'd been previously stalked 4 years by John Hull, a 62-year-old retired civil servant who bombarded her with love letters and phone calls. And he stopped pursuing her, I think, like, what year was she murdered?
1999.
Okay, so I think he stopped sending her letters in like 97 once he was told to stop. And he was ruled out pretty quickly from her attack. But I just think it's odd. I mean, maybe not odd because she's a celebrity, but that this woman got handed this kind of thing twice, you know?
Yeah, from my understanding is that when her colleagues talk about it and talk about how it's incredibly common to have people that write you all kinds of strange letters, that threaten you, that talk to you about being obsessed with you, pretend they have relationships with you, all of the kinds of things we talked about in the 2 episodes about stalking. And they talk about it as like, of course, she had received letters before. Of course, there was just that part of being in public life. But there wasn't anything at that current moment that was particularly threatening, apparently, about what she was living on a day-to-day basis. There were a lot of suspects originally, and it took a full year before they actually charged someone. Alan Farthing was Jill's fiance, and they were actually to be married that September, which is super sad. And he was a suspect. There was Bob Wheaton, who was her past boyfriend and also boss. They were dating when he was her boss. And there was a situation where they were to move in together, and there was a home that was purchased, and she gave him a bunch of money. And so originally the police saw this like 35,000 pounds that he owed her and saw that as a motive, like, okay, possibly he wanted to kill her to get out of the debt. But they were still very close, and he explained it as Bob had borrowed this money to buy this house, but they were supposed to live there together, and it was supposed to be something they were doing together. And so it ended up being a nothing lead, basically. They also suspected Mr. Roseman, who was her business agent, who had written a book about a presenter, which is what they call news anchors in England, had written a book about a presenter who was shot and murdered.
Wow.
That was suspicious at the time. And he had a reputation for being really tough and all of this. But basically, there was a lot of questioning. You know, there was, of course, just like with any very public figure that is well loved, there's so much investigation and so much outcry from the public wanting somebody to blame. And basically, Mr. Roseman was her business agent. I saw the interview with him, and it was like, if you think I was going to cut off financial revenue from Jill Dando, like, even though we were personally friends and friendly, and I would never, ever, ever want to hurt her, take into account what's my motive. Like, this is a main part of my finances. Like, why would I kill the cash cow?
Yeah.
Which obviously sounds cold, but also true.
I mean, he's defending himself.
Yeah, he's saying like, no, I loved her, of course, but also what possible? I only stand to lose. I lose my friend and my business with this. So these three were pretty much ruled out because, of course, police always look at the people closest to you first. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what she did that morning. So she was killed around 11:30, and what she did is she left her fiance's home around 10 or so. They have all of this on all the cameras that are around the city. They were able to take hours and hours and days and piece together all of where she went from receipts and from all of the cameras. So if you guys don't think you're like not on camera everywhere you go, you are, because there's cameras in all of the stoplights. But this is England. So in London, like everything is really close together. So she goes to the petrol station and fills her tank. And then she goes to the town center and she goes into a couple of different stores and she buys copy paper, fax paper. She returns to her car and then she leaves and goes to her apartment, which was on Gowan Avenue. And she arrives there at about 11:30 and she's outside her home and she walks up to the door. And just before she gets to the door, she's shot and killed on her doorstep. What they determined by watching all of this footage is that she wasn't followed. I didn't even think of, right? My mind doesn't work like a policeman's. The first thing they realized was, because they thought someone followed her and like, how would they know she was going there was their first question. Like, how would anybody know where she was going to be?
Right.
Except for these people closest to her. Her fiance had an alibi. He was back at his home. Like no one was there, and no one actually knew that she was doing these particular errands. Although Mr. Roseman, her business agent that I was mentioning before, did say the reason why she was going back to her home was to grab some faxes from me that she needed to sign. We always feel bad about that kind of thing.
Like, could I have caused it?
Yeah, of course he didn't. The person would have just picked a different moment. But she wasn't followed. So Mr. Roseman did know she was going to go there, but wasn't there, didn't know the timing, had an alibi. But they started to go down that road of who knew she was going to be there? Who did she tell? And why was she killed? They could not figure out a motive through all of these conversations with all of these people closest to her.
So strange. Usually there's something.
I know,
right?
They weren't uncovering. You can imagine they've got this high profile person that's so well loved, and they probably as people really liked her too, as their news person that delivered. News people become very beloved because they give us all of the hard things and the positive things,
and they end up in our living rooms.
Yeah,
and we get to know them, and
yes, and you can imagine how much projection and how much obsession or love or what have you, like not only normal adoration, but all of the obsessive stuff that would come from someone who's in your living room all day long. So they couldn't figure out a motive. Yes, there had been threatening letters. The BBC was getting threats. This was during the Baltic War.
Okay.
There was a Serbian who had wrote a letter taking credit for Dando's murder. This person had written it to the BBC. They got this kind of thing all the time. There was some investigation around. There was thought to be sleepers in the country that wanted to punish Britain for, there had been a bombing, I think 3 days prior to that in Serbia. And so the theory became, okay, well, because of the way her murder occurred, on the surface looked like it might have been a professionally arranged killing. Maybe one of these three guys, maybe the Serbians, maybe some political figure, maybe somebody from Crime Watch. Maybe it wasn't them personally, but maybe they hired somebody or it was execution style. But that didn't pan out either. They didn't get anything from it. They had this letter, but there was nothing that of this person that was taking credit for it. But it just didn't track. It didn't make sense, and they didn't have they weren't given any other information or evidence. So then, what the police decide to do is they decide to go kind of back to the basics. When you go a few months and you realize that you've kind of gone down all the leads and they're not fruitful a lot of times. And you guys who watch true crime documentaries, you guys all realize there's always a point at which, the detectives go back to all the original evidence and the original interviews and they try to see because there is this belief that your answer is in that first chunk of information, but you just don't have enough knowledge about that person, about their life, about what was going on, to actually have those things mean anything at first. So they go back to the beginning because nothing's panning out. There was a traffic warden who attempted to issue a blue Range Rover a ticket near the house. And I don't know about, it's, it says they attempted to. I guess they didn't, or they got distracted or something happened, but the person didn't get the ticket. But there was this traffic warden that talked about this Range Rover that they took notice of. And then on cameras, this Range Rover, this blue Range Rover, is seen speeding away from the murder site shortly afterwards. And then on multiple cameras across the city where this person is like really speeding and practically running lights and all of that. So they end up following Range Rovers 4 months.
Wow.
They have no license plate. They're like putting out, they don't have anything else to do. Like, they're just trying to figure this out. They have this lead that they go back. They find this, like, we never explored the blue Range Rover. Let's give it a shot. So they do. Then they do something, in the vein of the Crime Watch show that she was a part of, what they would do, of course, just like on our unsolved crime shows here in the U.S., is they release a bunch of information about the blue Range Rover to try to get people to call in.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. Here's the thing. There was more than one person that was escaping the scene fast. There was this guy in the blue Range Rover, and then there was a guy that walked away and walked to the bus stop and was seen like walking really fast away with a jacket on and sweating profusely and was standing at the bus station. So there were a lot of things they were trying to follow up on. Plus, they had these personal life people, and then they have this Crime Watch. Maybe it's one of the people she talked about on Crime Watch, and then they have that it's some kind of political hitman. They're just going everywhere.
They're all over the place.
Yeah, for sure. Then they get a call from some guy who becomes an informant. And this guy says that there are active criminals in this higher level drug group and that they had it out for her because of something on Crime Watch or whatever. But he basically says, like, I have information and it's part of this drug group. So the cop goes and covertly records this guy, interviews this informant. And they discuss this blue Range Rover because that's how the informant clues into, okay, I know that vehicle. It's attached to these drug people that I know. That's what it's got to be. The informant calls in. And so that was actually enough for, after the interview with this informant, it was enough for police to put wiretaps. They actually, on this drug, kingpin, for lack of a better word, who owns this blue Range Rover, it was enough to put wiretaps. And then they followed this guy for a while. Like,
what about him?
I feel for these cops.
What about this guy over here?
They get this informant. They get all this information from all these different places, and this is police work. You go down all these leads, right?
True.
You try to figure out what's real, what's not. They spend months, and it turns out that this informant was lying the whole time because he had a debt from this drug gang. And he thought if he could put suspicion on them, then he could get them in trouble and then his debt would go away.
Okay.
Didn't work out.
No, it did not.
All right, so this is other witness. This man running away that's sweating at the bus stop. And they have like police drawn photo. And he becomes the number one suspect now. How many have we been through? But again, this is police work. This is what you would do for a living if you're a detective. And they do a police drawing of this person, and they release this photo. And they have largely talked about this as being a big mistake because it caused a lot of unnecessary work. When you release a photo like that, or like the blue Range Rover description, you're just going to get a lot of calls, a lot of bullshit, a lot of distraction. And there are people that have to answer that phone, take down all the person's information, and then cops are expected to like follow through with all of those different things.
Mm-hmm.
This man calls in and says, like, that looks like me and I was at that bus station that day. And his name is James Shackleton. So he basically places himself in the middle of this investigation.
It's like, that's
Hey,
me.
that's me.
That's me right there.
This is an interesting character. This guy is a really interesting character. One of the detectives is like, he was a massive man. And I've seen the video of him. He's like very, very tall and very, very thick, very tall. And he was an undertaker and he drove a hearse. So you're not going to miss this guy.
He's hard to find in a crowd.
So hard to distinguish.
My God.
So he says that he was being chased by a man and ran to the bus stop, and that's why he was sweating.
Okay.
Super suspicious, super weird guy. He's arrested because they're like, this seems, no, we don't like this guy. We like him for this, as cops would say. He's arrested and a search is conducted of his house. And although this guy is very odd, they find coffins in his house.
Oh, God.
Because, well, he's an undertaker, so it's not that weird, but usually you keep that shit at work.
That's what I mean. Like, yeah.
There was a letter to the BBC that he had written about something. He was just a really odd guy, and he says that he'd been out collecting wood to make coffins in the community. So
it makes me think of that Florence and the Machine song. My boy builds coffins. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then it starts to track, right? Okay, I was out collecting wood to make coffins. He was probably stealing wood to make coffins. He was being chased by a man. He was sweating at the bus stop. Like, okay, that seems to track now. But listen, they search his house and nothing really comes of it. Like, he's this odd, quirky guy, but that doesn't give us evidence to make him the killer.
I mean, if you were a killer just because you were odd, we'd have a lot of killers.
Oh my gosh! And some people do get convicted.
I might be a killer.
Well, I mean, we've always suspected, haven't we, everyone? All right, so on to the next thing. Like, these guys are just lead after lead, but you could understand. It's kind of like if we didn't know how Princess Diana died, or we didn't know.
Where do you start?
They're spending a lot of time. And granted, it has not even been a year at this point from the murder, but time's a ticking. Of course, the court of public opinion is going, hello, what's happening? So now they look, again, they're going down the trail of like, let's look at all of the original evidence so that we make sure that we followed every lead, and knowing what we know now, what makes sense. So they look at the ballistics of the bullets. There was a casing that was on the ground that was found. So they look at the forensic of that, and they notice that there are some printings on the bullet that had like a handmade feel to it. It wasn't the bullet that everybody would have. And so that gave them the sense that, okay, maybe there's something unique to this. Mm-hmm. Plus, there was also some bruising on Jill's arm that suspects that someone would have grabbed her and like tried to turn her, and been unsuccessful, or not knew her, but was trying to have a personal moment with her in this killing. And so and touched her, right? So that would have maybe left some fibers on them, some this. I mean, I get it's like almost a year later, like they're not going to get anything, but looking at this and looking back at the messages from the beginning of the investigation, meaning the phone calls, a lot of the phone calls that they got, this uncovered this guy named Barry George. Now, Barry is an odd fellow as well. He used a lot of aliases. Barry Balsera, which is Freddie Mercury's real last name. There was a couple of other like rock star real last names, Gary Glitter's real last name, and different people. Like, he would use those names, and he'd always had all these bunches of aliases.
I read about this guy.
Yeah, he was an odd guy, and he had a history of being charged for attempted rape. He had another charge for assault on a woman. The month after the killing, the way they got to him, and what I meant to say was the way they got to him was that the month after the killing, he had called 3 to 4 different places to establish his alibi. So he had called this place or that place, like things connected to him, and how long was I there? Where was I? This kind of thing. And then those people were actually calling the tip line and saying, I know this guy, and he's calling me to tell me where he was or ask me how long he was at some place, a coffee shop or whatever. And it's weird. And so they're going back and looking at all those original phone calls and those original tips, and they realize they've got a little bit of a chain where there's like 3, 4, 5, 6 different people that are calling in about what they connected as this one guy, Barry George.
There's some other stuff. I don't know if you're going to get to it, but other things about his personality too. Potential history of what we previously called Asperger's. And he also had other traits, histrionic, narcissistic, paranoid traits. These were some things that we saw with him. And that he also had a history of assault, stalking, including Prince Charles.
Good suspect.
That's right. The profile of this guy would be suspect.
Yeah. He was very much, they had these calls from people that they uncovered and they made the connection with because they had more information. And then all of these things and a rap sheet, right? Like he had a record.
Yeah.
As well as right there in current day, he was unemployed and he spent his whole days walking around, following and talking to women on the street.
Oh.
That's kind of what he did.
No big deal.
And so this was all enough for them to get surveillance on him and search his home. And inside the home, they find holsters for guns, lists of firearms, a lot of media coverage of Jill Dando. He lived like a half mile from the crime scene. A lot of magazines, but no actual evidence connecting him to the murder, but still coming up with a very good suspect. But now it's been 1 full year since the murder. They arrest him on suspicion of murder of Jill Dando. And in his interviews in the police station, which they kept him there for, I think in England they can do like the 98 hours or 96 hours. And they kept him there the whole time talking to him. Then one of the things that he does, like at every moment, this guy just convicts himself. In his interview, he lies throughout the whole thing. He would answer a question with a lie. So they would say, "Do you know who Jill Dando is?" And he would say no. But they had found 45,000 articles.
Yeah,
and,
that's odd. Okay.
And then they would say, "Was that a lie?" And he would say yes. This was the questioning. He maintained a position all the way through it. To this day, he remains congruent with that he didn't know who Jill Dando was. But there were all these pictures, etc. So they hold him in custody for 96 hours, which is how much you can do it without charging someone. He would deny that he was the person in the pictures in his own home that was holding guns, but they never found a gun. So they didn't have any real evidence at this point. They continue to investigate him. They let him out and everything, but they continue to investigate him to try to figure out how to charge him and if he's really the killer. So they have this coat from him, from his house, that is the coat that they assume he wore. It's a year later, but they get very excited because they find gunshot residue inside the pocket of this jacket. And it was the type that was found at the crime scene. Super not great evidence, but it was something. And based on that vagueness, they were able to charge Barry George with murder. Now all the testing begins, right? All the psychologists come in, all the people come in to interview him. There's attorneys, all the things. And people that met with Barry truly believed he was not capable of doing this kind of execution-style murder and then not talking about it for a year.
Okay.
Like, that just sort of wasn't... He was literally talking to everyone on the street all day long. He's like, they said I was stalking, but like I was following. I wasn't stalking. Just like this guy. They do.
I love the semantics.
I know.
I was just following. I wasn't stalking.
It was following and he says, like, whenever anybody just gave me any indication that they didn't want to talk to me, I would just walk away. And I'm thinking, like, could you really read the indications that someone doesn't want to talk to you? But anyway, they do all this psych testing. They figure out he's in a borderline range which is very low intelligence, His working memory and many other aspects of the psych testing were at like 1%,
Jesus.
meaning like 99% of people would be better at working memory. He lied about being in the army. He lied about things you don't have to lie about. He was just creating lots of fictions. Now we see this in lots of different kinds of not only mental health disorders, but organic disorders and personality disorders, like lying and all these kinds of things. But when you watch him and when you see all of this information from people that actually studied him and tested him and everything, you can see that they're like, I don't really think he was capable of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's even one story where when he was much, much younger, he actually went on the news. He set up this whole thing as if he was like a Steve Earle guy where he was going to do roller skates over 4 buses, you know, where they used to do those kinds of things in the 80s and 90s where, you know, and he ends up doing it on television, trying to jump on roller skates 4 buses. He dislocates his spine. He breaks his femur. Like, it's like this weird. It boggles the mind how.
Who did this guy think he was?
This is, I think, like, these are some delusional things.
You think? It's like he's on PCP.
Does it really seem like the guy? To the cops, yes. But as somebody who comes off like a harmless, quirky kind of fantasist, but also, don't forget, this guy's been arrested and charged with assault on a woman and attempted rape and all of these kinds of odd goings on. Another piece of evidence comes. He had actually been arrested, and maybe Kathy was alluding to this earlier, but he had been arrested after being caught on the grounds of Kensington Palace with a coil of rope, wearing combat gear, and with a 12-inch hunting knife.
Jesus Christ.
And they kind of connected that to Princess Diana at the time. So then the court of public opinion and the cops and the media, it's, you know, they kind of connect the two, like, oh, he was there to maybe hurt Princess Diana, and they've always had this, they're always making this connection between Diana and Jill. All right. So he's charged and this trial begins, and it's very circumstantial. They've got the residue, but no other particles anywhere. No evidence of owning a weapon. Again, though, the defense suggests underworld hitmen. They suggest Serbian killers.
It's just like they're throwing darts.
Yeah, it's hard. So Barry gets convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. And he was locked up for 8 years. And then actually, this guy, a previously wrongly convicted man who became an innocence advocate, took on his case and went before what England calls the Criminal Cases Review Commission. And they actually decided that the residue was irrelevant to the case. It was purely circumstantial and didn't connect or make anything really happen. And the case was dismissed and Barry was released after 8 years in prison. And that is why the case remains unsolved to this day.
What a flipping mess.
Yeah. And the cops that arrested and put him in prison still believe he is the one who did it. Like, I mean, I don't know what they say to their nearest and dearest, but publicly what they talk about is that they still believe that that was the wrong decision and that he was the one who did it. But also, he was convicted on public opinion and circumstantial evidence. But as we know in this country, that happens all the time. But that is why the case remains unsolved to this day. They had it solved, and then apparently they didn't have it solved. So that's where we stand.
Good Lord. That's a lot of confusion. And I could see where the investigators were pulled to these certain suspects just because they were so bizarre. But it also sounds like whoever did this, there was such a wild goose chase around it that, you know, it's like, it probably was a lot simpler than that.
Probably, you know? But they had no evidence.
They had no evidence.
I mean, nobody even witnessed the murder right on her doorstep at 11:30 during the day. Broad daylight killing. Like, really?
Yeah.
It's so hard to believe that that was the way it went down. But what I hear, And what I experienced looking at all of this and kind of tracking all of this narrative was that there was a lot of really hard police work that went into this case. They followed so many leads. They questioned so many people, hours on the phone, all these different things going back to the original case. There was just a ton of what I would say good police work to try to figure it out. And it seems to me in the end, they made their best decision. Mm-hmm. They didn't have a lot of what we would call evidence, but I imagine, it's always different when you're close to it. So I imagine they really do believe that they had the right guy, but the courts did not bear that out. He was wrongly convicted according to, the courts, and that's the way it stands to this day. So we really don't know what happened.
Wow.
But thank you for coming out. So can you see why I wasn't going to do all the cases?
She has 6 more, folks. Hang tight. We have another 20 minutes of this show.
Oh, no. This was 40 minutes of discussion on one case. So I can imagine and also it wasn't like, do we really want to just talk about the surface shenanigans of each case? Like, is that really our jam? Like, what does that do? Let's talk about each thing.
Yeah, I guess I just always think in situations like this, how frustrating and discouraging it is for the family members of these folks. Like, this is a long time to not know. And I realize, like, some people go on never knowing, but thinking they're getting that close, and then it ends up just being a dead end.
Well, and can you imagine the devastation when this guy gets out of prison 8 years later?
8 years, like they think they've gotten, not that you get closure, but they think that, there's been some level of justice or whatever. And then they're like, oh, oops, wrong, no.
Yeah. So I feel for them terribly. And if, according to the courts, Barry George there's no evidence that Barry George did it. So I feel for his family as well. According to everyone, he was wrongly convicted. So I feel for his family as well, because that's a lot of time now that has gone by. And if the real killer is out there, a lot of that evidence is long gone. So now it's truly a cold case. And that's really, really sad. But thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you. I appreciate you, Kathy.
I appreciate you.
All right. This has been an episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.